My name is Adriana Reyes. I am 29 years old, and I used to believe that patience was the same thing as progress. I was wrong. I had been driving for my father's car service for 3 years by the time any of this happened. Not Uber, not a rideshare app, a private car service, the kind that contracts with corporate clients and law firms and a handful of hotels that have relationships with specific operators. My father, Hector Reyes, had built it over 18 years from a single-town car and a cell phone and a reputation for punctuality that he had cultivated the way some people cultivate a garden, daily, without drama, with an attention to the small things that most people let slide. The company was called Reyes Premier Transport. It had 11 vehicles when I joined, 14 by the time I'm describing, and a client list that included 4 regional law firms, 2 mid-size corporate accounts, and a rotation of hotel concierge relationships in downtown Portland, Oregon, that my father had spent a decade maintaining. I had a commercial driver's license, a clean record, and a knowledge of Portland's street grid that I had developed not from GPS dependency, but from the 3 months I spent before my first shift driving every major route at different times of day to understand where the delays actually came from, as opposed to where the mapping apps predicted them. My father had not asked me to do this. I had done it because I believed at that point in my life that the quality of the preparation was what separated adequate from excellent, and I wanted to be excellent at the job before I showed up to do it. I had also, by the end of my second year, begun keeping a private folder, dispatch notes I had flagged, route optimizations I had submitted, client work that had gotten absorbed into the company's wins without my name attached. I kept it at home. I was not sure why I kept it. I simply could not make myself let the documentation disappear. What I had not anticipated was that showing up excellently would be largely invisible. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. Think about a time you gave everything you had to something, and the people closest to you looked right past it. Not out of cruelty. Just out of habit. Because I think what I'm about to describe is going to feel familiar to more people watching this than it probably should. The car services dispatch was managed by my father and on evenings and weekends by my older brother, Tomas. Tomas was 33 and had been with the company for 6 years. He held the title of operations manager, which meant he assigned routes, handled client complaints, and sat in on the quarterly planning conversations I was not invited to attend. He was not a bad dispatcher, he was organized and reliable, and clients responded well to him on the phone. What he was not, and what I had understood within my first 6 months, was someone who tracked pattern. He assigned the same drivers to the same routes out of habit rather than optimization, and he did not adjust for the variables that actually affected on-time performance, weather, event schedules, construction cycles, the particular Thursday evening congestion that built up on Burnside whenever there was anything happening at the convention center. I had flagged this once, early in my second year, in a written note I gave my father directly. I laid out 5 route adjustments with projected time savings, including the data I had compiled from my own logs over 14 months. My father read it, I believe. He referenced one of the adjustments in passing about 2 weeks later, but nothing changed in the dispatch structure. The note was neither acknowledged nor explicitly dismissed. It was simply absorbed, the way a comment gets absorbed by a room when the room has already decided on something else. My mother, Pilar, did the company's bookkeeping from home on a part-time basis and occasionally answered the main line when both my father and Tomas were unavailable. She was warm with clients and precise with numbers and had a particular gift for de-escalating complaints that I had watched her deploy dozens of times, a tone that was neither defensive nor overly apologetic, simply grounded, the voice of someone who understood both the problem and its actual size. She and I were close in the specific way that a mother and daughter are close when they both know more about a situation than they have said out loud to each other. My father was 58 that year. He had the posture of a man who had spent 3 decades getting in and out of cars and had decided somewhere along the way that the physical cost of the work was simply part of the contract. He ran his hands over the steering wheel of a new vehicle the way some people run their hands over woodwork, checking for things that hadn't settled right. He could tell from the sound of an engine at idle whether a vehicle was going to need attention in the next 2 weeks. He had built the company from something real, and he knew it was real because he had made every mistake himself first, without anyone to catch him. I respected this about him. I still do. What I could not make him see in 3 years of trying was that respecting how he built it did not mean I had nothing to contribute to how it ran. The quarterly planning meeting happened every 3 months in my father's study, a room at the back of his and my mother's house that had 2 chairs pulled up to a desk and a whiteboard on the wall that he had installed himself and which still listed, in permanent marker he could not fully erase, a route plan from 2 years prior. Tomas attended. My mother attended when the bookkeeping figures needed to be walked through. I had asked, at the end of my first year, whether I could attend. My father said he would think about it. 3 quarterly meetings passed before I asked again. That time he said the meetings were really more of an operations discussion, and he didn't want to pull me away from my shifts for something that didn't directly affect my route responsibilities. I pointed out that I was not scheduled on the morning the meetings occurred. He said he'd keep it in mind. I was never invited. The specific incident that made the pattern impossible to mistake happened in February of my 2nd year, on a morning when the company had a high-value contract run, a law firm partner who needed airport pickup and a noon delivery to a downtown client, with a tight connection window that required precise timing. The assigned driver was a contracted driver named Gil who had been with the company for 4 years and was reliable in ordinary conditions. The conditions that morning were not ordinary. There was ice on the Sunset Highway approach and the airport access roads were running 15 minutes slow. I knew this because I had been out since 7 a.m. on an earlier run and had driven the relevant section of road myself. I texted Tomas at 8:47 to flag the delay risk and suggest he alert Gil to leave 10 minutes early and take the surface route through Beaverton. Tomas replied, already handled. Gil was 22 minutes late to the airport. The law firm partner missed the connection window and had to take a cab to the downtown client. The firm called to complain. My father spent 40 minutes on the phone managing it. That evening I was in the break room at the garage when my father came in to make coffee. I did not bring up the morning. He poured his coffee and stood at the counter and said, without looking at me, "We had a rough one today." "I know," I said. "I flagged it to Tomas before 8:50. My father nodded slowly. Tomas said there were road conditions. "I sent him the specific route concern with enough time to reroute," I said. 40 minutes before it became a problem. My father looked at me then. He had an expression I had come to recognize, not dismissive exactly, more the expression of someone who has already filed a thing in a category and is not interested in reopening the file. "We'll debrief with Tomas tomorrow," he said. I straightened the stack of napkins on the break room counter. I said nothing. The debrief happened the next morning. I was not included. Tomas told me later in passing that they had decided to add a weather check step to the pre-run protocol on contract days. It was the same step I had been running informally for 14 months and had described in the written note I gave my father in my 2nd year. No one said this. 2 weeks after the incident, my father introduced a revised dispatch checklist at a brief team meeting in the garage. He walked through the items. The weather check step was item 4. When he finished, a driver named Marcus asked where the checklist had come from. My father said, "We've been developing it internally." I was standing 6 feet away. I looked at the floor and then I looked back at my father, and he was already moving to the next item. That evening I drove a 4-hour shift and came home and sat at my kitchen table for a long time without doing anything in particular. The feeling I was sitting with was not anger exactly. It was the feeling of having been present for something and simultaneously not present for it. The experience of being in the room and not being in the room simultaneously, on a long enough timeline that you begin to wonder if the room is something you have invented. My mother called that night around 9. I told her work was fine. She said, in the particular register that meant she knew it wasn't and was giving me room to say so if I wanted to. I didn't that night. I thanked her and said I was tired and got off the phone. The pattern, once I could see it, had a shape that went back years before I joined the company. When I was 17, I rebuilt my father's client scheduling system. This is not an exaggeration. He had been running client appointments off a combination of a paper ledger and a contacts list in his phone, and I spent 2 weeks that summer designing a spreadsheet-based tracking system that linked client profiles, contract terms, billing cycles, and vehicle assignments. I modeled it on systems I had read about in a business operations book I had checked out from the school library, adapted for the specific needs of a small car service. I showed it to my father on a Sunday afternoon in August. He looked at it for 10 minutes, asked me 2 questions about how the billing column worked, and said, "This is nice, Adriana." He used it every day for the next 4 years. When the company upgraded to digital dispatch software in my freshman year of college, the setup technician told my father that the data migration would require someone to manually reconcile the existing client records, a process that would take the better part of a week. My father mentioned this at a family dinner as a coming headache. I drove home the following weekend and did the reconciliation myself. 57 client records cross-checked against the billing ledger and the contract files, cleaned and migrated over 4 days. I drove back to school Sunday night. My father, when I called to tell him it was done, said, "You didn't have to do that." I said I wanted to help. He said, "Tell your mother thank you." I held the phone for a moment after he said it. Then I said I would and got off the call. In my first year driving, I maintained the highest on-time rate of any driver on the fleet, 91% across 11 months, in a city where weather and event congestion make anything above 85% a genuine operational achievement. I tracked this myself in a log I kept on my phone, because the company's performance tracking was done quarterly and informally and did not break down by driver in a format anyone regularly reviewed. When I mentioned the number to Tomas in passing, he said, "Yeah, you've been solid." I had also, in my second year, personally retained a client that the company had been at risk of losing. A law firm that had been with Reyes Premier for 7 years had a new office manager who was consolidating vendors and had told my father's main contact at the firm that they were evaluating alternatives. I had driven one of the firm's senior partners for 3 years and had, separately, developed a relationship with the new office manager through the incidental contact that happens when you are reliable and present and know someone's name. I asked her directly what the firm needed to see to stay with us. She told me, faster response on last-minute bookings and a dedicated contact rather than a rotating dispatch number. I brought both requests to my father. He implemented a dedicated line for that firm within 2 weeks, and the contract renewed. My father told the firm's contact that the company had made some service improvements and was glad to keep the relationship. He did not mention that I had identified the risk, initiated the conversation with the office manager, and delivered the specific requests. The office manager, to her credit, emailed me separately to say thank you. I printed the email and added it to the folder. I had been adding to that folder for 2 years by then. Dispatch notes I had flagged. Route optimizations I had submitted. The client reconciliation I had done over a 4-day weekend. The written note with the 5 route adjustments. The email from the office manager. Not because I planned to use any of it. I simply could not make myself let the documentation disappear. The last thing I did before the incident that changes this story was negotiate the renewal terms on the company's vehicle maintenance contract. The existing contract with the service garage had not been renegotiated in 6 years. I had been talking with the garage's service manager over the course of several drop-offs across 18 months, the kind of relationship that builds up in increments, through small conversations and remembered details. And I knew from those conversations that the garage had recently lost 2 other fleet contracts and was actively looking to retain volume. I prepared a brief comparison of the existing terms against 2 competing garages and brought it to my father with a recommended ask. He took the meeting with the garage himself. He came back with terms that were 11% better on labor rates and included a free loaner vehicle provision for scheduled maintenance days. He told my mother about it at dinner. He described it as a renegotiation he had been meaning to do for a while and finally got to. I was at the table. I refilled my water glass and said nothing. The night it started was a Wednesday in November, near the end of a double shift that I had picked up because one of the contracted drivers had called out sick and my father needed coverage and I was the one who answered when he called. I had been on since noon. It was 11:45 p.m. when I got the notification from dispatch, Tomas running the late board, that my last scheduled run had cancelled. I was on the east side of the city, 6 miles from the garage, with an empty car and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been operating at full attention for 12 hours and has just been told the final task has been removed. I pulled off on a side street to reset the dispatch app and noticed, 3 blocks ahead under a transit shelter, a woman standing in the rain with a stroller. The rain that night was the steady Pacific Northwest kind, not dramatic, just persistent and cold, and the shelter had a roof but no sides, and the woman had a blanket pulled over the stroller and was standing with her back to the wind at an angle that was clearly not sustainable for much longer. I drove the 3 blocks and pulled up to the curb. She was in her mid-50s, I thought, though the rain and the late hour made precise reading difficult. The baby in the stroller was perhaps 8 months old, wrapped in the blanket and apparently asleep despite everything. The woman looked at my car with the particular wariness of someone who has been standing in the rain long enough that an unfamiliar car pulling up does not immediately register as good news. I lowered the window. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" I said. She looked at the car. She looked at me. "I don't have cash," she said. "My app isn't working." "I'm not charging," I said. "I'm on my way back to the garage." "Where do you need to go?" She hesitated for a moment in the way people hesitate when something is too straightforward and they are waiting for the catch. Then she folded the stroller's rain cover down more securely and said, "Eastmoreland? 34th. It was 4 miles south." I got out and helped her collapse the stroller and load it into the trunk, and she settled into the back seat with the baby, who had woken briefly and looked at me with the absolute composure that very young children sometimes have, as though they have already assessed the situation and found it acceptable. We drove mostly in silence. She asked once if I did this often, meaning the free ride, and I said not regularly, but the night made sense for it. She looked out the window. Near the end of the drive she said, "What's your name?" "Adriana," I said. She said, "I'm going to remember that." I pulled up to the address on 34th, a well-kept craftsman on a quiet block, porch light on, the kind of house that looks like someone has been maintaining it carefully for a long time. I helped her get the stroller out of the trunk. She had the baby on her hip by then, awake and looking around with the same composure as before. She took my hand with her free hand and held it for a moment, not shaking it, just holding it, the way people hold a thing they want to make sure they have actually registered. She said thank you in the plain, direct way that means it. Then she went up the porch steps and I drove to the garage. I logged the run as a comp in the dispatch system, deadhead return, no charge, and drove home. I did not think about it again particularly. It was the kind of thing that happened at the end of a long shift and felt complete in itself. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, my father called my cell phone at 9 a.m. "Can you come by the house?" he said. "I need to talk to you about something." The phrasing was unusual. He did not typically phrase requests as needs. I asked if everything was all right. He said yes, just come by when you can. I arrived at 10. His car was in the driveway, and so was a car I did not recognize, dark blue Oregon plates, a style that suggested a recent model year without being ostentatious. I noticed it and moved past it. My father met me at the front door. His expression was one I could not immediately read, not the categorizing expression, not the already filed it expression, something else. Something that had been reorganized. "There's someone in my study," he said. "She asked to meet you." I followed him down the hall to the study. The door was open. The whiteboard was on the wall with its ghost route plan. Both chairs were pulled up to the desk. In the chair across from my father's usual seat was the woman from the rain. She had the same quality of presence she'd had at the transit shelter, the quality of someone who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the circumstances to catch up to it. She was dressed differently, but the composure was identical. She looked at me when I came in and said, "I told you I would remember your name." My father was standing in the doorway behind me. I turned to look at him. His expression had shifted again, still the reorganized quality, but with something underneath it that I had not seen in 3 years of working for him. It looked, for the first time, like he was not sure who was the most prepared person in the room. Her name was Carol Whitfield. My father told me this as he came around me into the study and took his seat behind the desk, which gave me a moment to cross to the remaining chair and sit down without having to locate a neutral expression while moving. I found one anyway, the particular neutral I had developed over 3 years of being in rooms where I was not sure what was expected of me. Carol Whitfield was looking at me with the same level attention she'd had at the transit shelter and on the porch steps. She had a canvas tote bag on the floor beside her chair and a leather folder on her lap closed. "I appreciate you coming on short notice," she said. "Of course," I said. My father cleared his throat. "Carol reached out to the company this morning," he said. "Through the main line. She asked for you by name." I looked at Carol. "I told you I would remember," she said. There was something in the way she said it, not arch, not pointed, just precise. The delivery of someone who keeps their word as a matter of course and finds it unremarkable. "How can I help you?" I said. She opened the leather folder. She produced a single sheet of paper and placed it on the desk between us. It was a printed summary. I could see columns and a header, though the text was facing her, and she turned it to face me with one clean motion. It was a contract summary. Reyes Premier Transport, across the top. Dated 3 years prior. Client name, Whitfield Family Holdings. I looked at it. I looked at my father. His expression was the reorganized one, the one I had seen in the hallway, but now I could read the layer underneath it. It was not quite discomfort. It was the expression of a man who is watching a conversation he thought he was going to lead take a shape he had not anticipated. Whitfield Family Holdings, I said. We contract private car services for our portfolio companies, Carol said. Executive transportation, airport runs, client hospitality. We have 7 companies in the Portland metro area. We've been with a national provider for the past 4 years. The contract comes up for renewal in February. She paused. I've been looking at regional alternatives. I looked at the summary again. The existing contract volume was listed, approximately $340,000 annually. My father had not mentioned this to me. I did not know if he knew about it yet, whether Carol had told him before I arrived, or whether this was the first he was hearing the full number. From the quality of his stillness I could not tell. How did you find the company? I said. I've been doing regional research for 2 months, she said. Reyes Premier came up in 3 separate referrals from firms I respect. I called the main line yesterday to schedule a meeting. She looked at me. When I called, I asked the person who answered if there was a driver named Adriana. I wanted to know if you were still there. Something shifted slightly in my chest, a small physical adjustment like a room settling. Why did that matter? I said. Because of what you did Wednesday night, she said. Not the ride. I've had people do kind things. What I noticed was how you did it. You pulled over, you explained the situation plainly, you didn't make it transactional, and then you handled the logistics, the stroller, the trunk, without being asked and without making a production of it. And then on the drive you didn't fill the silence unnecessarily. She looked at me steadily. That's a specific set of qualities. The kind that either exist in a company's culture or don't. My father said, we pride ourselves on. I'd like to hear from Adriana, Carol said. Not sharply. Simply. My father stopped. She looked at me. Tell me how you handle a last-minute booking on a contract account. Walk me through it from the call. I walked her through it. Intake confirmation, vehicle availability check, route pre-assessment for the time of day and current conditions, client communication protocol, driver briefing. I described the weather check step, the one that was now item 4 on the dispatch checklist, the one I had been running informally for 14 months before it was formalized, as a standard pre-run practice, which it now was without specifying its origin. Carol was writing in her folder as I spoke. When I finished, she asked about on-time performance tracking. I told her what I tracked and how. She asked about escalation protocol for delays. I described the direct contact approach I used with clients, the specific wording, the timing, the goal of giving enough notice to be useful rather than enough to be technically compliant. She wrote more. Then she looked up. You said I several times in that description, she said. Is this how the company operates or how you operate? The room was very quiet. I looked at my father. He was looking at the surface of the desk. Both in some cases, I said. I developed some of these practices informally before they became company protocol. There's been some lag in the formalization. Carol considered this. She wrote one more thing and then she closed the folder. She reached into the canvas tote and produced a second document, a single folded page, and placed it on the desk in front of my father. That's our current contract's volume breakdown by service type, she said. I'm not sharing it to negotiate. I'm sharing it so you understand what we'd be bringing. She looked at him directly. I'm interested in a pilot arrangement. 3 months, 2 of our portfolio companies. If it works, we expand. She paused. I want Adriana as the account lead. My father looked at the document. He looked at me. He looked at Carol. Account lead is a senior position, he said. We'd need to discuss the structure. I'm not asking you to reorganize the company, Carol said. I'm asking you to designate a point of contact for this account who has the decision-making authority to manage it. Based on what I've seen and what I've heard in the last 45 minutes, that person is your daughter. She let that sit for a moment. Is there a reason that's a problem? My father looked at me. It was a different look than the one from the hallway. The hallway look had been reorganized. This one was something older, something that had been waiting behind the reorganization. Something that did not have a clean name but that I recognized, because I had been waiting for it for 3 years. He said no. Carol Whitfield left at 11:45. My father walked her to the door and I heard their voices in the hallway, brief, professional, the close of a meeting, and then the front door and then his footsteps back down the hall. He came back into the study and stood in the doorway for a moment. The whiteboard was behind me. The ghost route plan was still visible in the upper right corner. He sat down in his chair. I had been deciding in the 12 minutes since Carol closed her folder how I wanted to do this. Not whether. I had known since I sat down that there was a conversation that needed to happen, and that it needed to happen now in this room, before we returned to the version of things where the moment dissolved into the ordinary and became another thing that was simply absorbed. The dispatch checklist, I said. Item 4. The weather and conditions pre-check. He looked at me. I submitted that to you in writing in February of my 2nd year, I said. A full note, 5 route adjustments. The weather check was one of them. You implemented it 8 months later after we lost the Hargrove run, and you presented it to the team as something we'd been developing internally. I paused. I was standing 6 feet away. His jaw tightened slightly. He did not speak. You told Mom that she'd handled the insurance transition, I said. Last spring. The plan comparison, the benefits calls, the enrollment paperwork. I did 11 hours of that work over 3 days while you were both at the house. She was in the room for most of it. He said, I didn't mean to imply. I know you didn't mean to, I said. That's what I've been trying to understand, whether this was something you were doing or something that was just happening. Because for 3 years I've been submitting notes you don't acknowledge, flagging problems you fix without attribution, building client relationships you announce as company wins, and I've been telling myself it was a system that needed time to adjust. That you were busy. That I needed to be more patient. I squared the folder on my lap before I looked up at him. You told me, when I asked about the quarterly meetings the second time, that they were an operations discussion and you didn't want to pull me away from my shifts. I wasn't on shift that morning. I checked. You knew that. He looked at the desk. I retained the Kellerman firm account, I said. I identified the risk, I had the conversation with their office manager, I brought you the 2 specific requests she gave me. You implemented them and called the contact to say the company had made service improvements. I have the office manager's thank you email. I printed it. My father's hands were flat on the desk. He was not looking at me and then he was. And the maintenance contract, I said. I spent 18 months building the relationship with the service manager. I prepared the comparison, I identified the leverage, I brought you the recommended ask. You took the meeting, you came back with 11% better labor rates and the loaner provision, and you told Mom at dinner it was a renegotiation you'd been meaning to get to. I looked at him. I was at the table. He said, Adriana. I'm not telling you this to make you feel something specific, I said. I'm telling you because Carol Whitfield walked into this room having never seen the inside of this company, and in 45 minutes she identified what I was and what I had been doing and asked for me by name. And I want to know if you can tell me why she was able to see it and you weren't. The silence that followed was the longest in the room since I had arrived. My father looked at his hands on the desk. When he spoke his voice had a different quality, lower, without the weight of management in it. I don't have a good answer for that, he said. I know, I said. My mother appeared in the doorway. She had been in the house the whole time, I had known she was there, and I think my father had too, and she stood in the frame with her arms crossed loosely and looked at my father the way she looked at him when she had already decided something. She said, Hector. He looked at her. You have a good answer, she said. You just don't want to say it out loud. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I didn't want to need you, he said. That's not, I don't mean it the way it sounds. I built this company by not needing anyone. By handling it myself. And watching you walk in and be better at parts of it than I was, he stopped. I didn't know what to do with that. So I absorbed it. I sat with that for a moment. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in 3 years and possibly longer. That's the answer, I said. I stood up. I did not slam the folder on the desk or deliver a final word designed to close the scene. I just stood up and my mother came in from the doorway, and the three of us stayed in the room together for a while, which was its own kind of accounting. The pilot arrangement with Whitfield Family Holdings started in January. I ran it as account lead, the title formalized in writing, which my father did without being asked again in the week after Carol's visit. By the end of the 3-month pilot, the 2 portfolio companies had renewed without a gap and 2 more were added. The full contract transferred in April. My name is in the engagement letter. Tomas took it better than I expected, which is to say he was quiet about it for 2 weeks and then asked me on a Tuesday morning in the garage if I could walk him through the account management process I was using. I did. We worked together on it. It turned out he was actually quite good at the client communication side once someone showed him the framework, which was something I hadn't known because we had never worked together on anything that required a framework before. My father and I have a standing check-in now, Thursday mornings, in the study. The whiteboard has been updated. The ghost route plan is gone. Carol Whitfield sends a brief email at the end of each month. 1 paragraph, no more. She writes what's working and what isn't in plain language, and she addresses it to me directly. I have printed every one. What I keep returning to is a simple mechanical fact. She was standing in the rain with her back to the wind, and I pulled over, and that is the whole of the original transaction. Everything that followed, the meeting, the contract, the Thursday check-ins, the way my father said I didn't want to need you in a voice I had never heard from him before, came from a stop that took 11 seconds to decide. I've thought a lot about what made me stop. I was exhausted. I was 6 miles from the garage. My shift was over and everything but the paperwork. And I stopped because the math was visible, and I've always been someone who does the thing when the math is visible, even when the timing isn't convenient. I think that quality, the one that made me stop at the curb and the one that made me build the spreadsheet at 17 and the one that made me keep the folder, is the same quality. It comes from the same place. And for 3 years I had been in an environment that was very good at making me doubt whether that place was real. It was real. It was always real. The folder was full. I think about the people watching this who are somewhere in that middle stretch, where you know what you're capable of, where the work is documented and the folder is full, and the room keeps looking past you. I don't have a clean resolution for that stretch. I know what got me through mine, and it wasn't one big moment. It was a lot of small decisions to keep the standards high even when the standards weren't being watched. To do the 11 hours even when someone else would get the credit. To stop at the curb. The stopping matters. Not because it always leads somewhere, but because it keeps you the kind of person who stops, and eventually that's the quality someone sees. If this story reached someone who needed it today, pass it along. That's the whole reason it's worth telling. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All names, characters, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or actual events is coincidental.